Hey there, how's it going? Breakfast all day. Christy and Alonso and Matt. So we're going to play some catch up now with a movie that I suspect we were all kind of dreading having to watch, and that is the 2-part, 4-hour documentary Leaving Neverland about Michael Jackson. Alonso, please tell us more.
Sure. So it's documentarian Dan Reed talking to two men who shared their stories of what they say was repeated years of abuse at the hands of Michael Jackson. James Safechuck, who had done a Pepsi commercial as a little kid and wound up going on the Bad tour, and then later Wade Robson, who met the singer when he was 7 and said that their relationship lasted until he was 14. And this is a 4-hour documentary, but it is, I think it sort of takes its time to sort of illustrate how the grooming process works, both with the young people and with their families, the aftermath of the abuse and how it affected their lives, and how it colored their lives as they entered adulthood, and then finally how in becoming fathers themselves they both realized the nature and the reality of what had happened to them, and then they're being willing to speak out about it for the first time after having in the past testified on Jackson's behalf, and other times when there were trials about this alleged behavior. There was a really good piece that somebody posted on my Facebook wall from about 4 or 5 years ago in the aftermath of the Penn State scandal, and basically talked about how people changing their story is part of the process of being a survivor and overcoming it. It's like there is a whole thing of denial and not wanting to acknowledge it as abuse and not wanting even to maybe acknowledge that it happened, to telling friends and loved ones and policemen and therapists, no, nothing happened, and then eventually at some point it just breaks and you tell that story. So I don't think it makes them unreliable witnesses that they change their story. It makes them that is typical behavior for people who have experienced that level of trauma in childhood.
Right, and we are seeing that as well with the Me Too movement, that a lot of women who for a long time denied it and didn't want to talk about it because they suppressed it. They told themselves what they had to tell themselves to survive psychologically.
Right.
We're seeing this here now as well. Yeah, a lot of what Wade Robson and James Safechuck have said has been shot down by a lot of folks because Wade Robson testified at the Michael Jackson trial in the mid-2000s. Michael Jackson was acquitted of the charges against him. And because, Macaulay Culkin and the other boy who was very prominent, Brett Barnes,
and also
Jordan,
Corey Feldman.
So all of them said, no, he never touched me. And so that is supposed to theoretically absolve Michael Jackson, whatever. And the idea that, he was a genius and he loved children and he did so much great charity work. And, he
was deprived of a childhood himself.
Yeah. Have you seen?
But he loved children.
Right. Have you seen his childhood?
Exactly.
Do you want to build a snowman?
I mean, there is something weird about that level of fame and what we as a society sort of ignored and looked away from, I don't think is ever going to happen again. Mm-hmm. I think that Kara Brown was talking about this on Keep It. It's sort of like you look at the Harvey Weinstein story and that's a failing in the industry, and you look at the R. Kelly story and that's a failing in the industry and also in the city where he lived and where he was perpetrating his crimes. But like Michael Jackson, that's a failure of the world because we all sort of saw all this weirdness going on, and we just decided that because we like the music so much and because he had endured this terrible childhood with his father that was just going to be fine.
But one of the things that as we talk about this and that pattern, for instance, makes me think about is that, do you guys see the Barry Crimmins documentary about him realizing this was the guy who was kind of the mentor to Bobcat Goldthwait, and he had this onstage breakdown where he kind of realizes and starts talking about his own abuse as a kid.
I've heard about this.
Right, and it's amazing. That documentary is unbelievable. And one of the things, and it blows me away in the documentary, is that he talks about forgiving his abuser because he says, we know from the evidence over and over and over and over again that people who abuse children were abused as children. And so sexually abused as children, and they go on to sexually abuse children. And it makes you think what did happen with Michael Jackson.
Indeed, yeah.
Right.
Did you watch the Oprah follow-up?
I did not. Did you?
I did,
Okay.
and she actually brings up the notion of forgiveness and forgiving Michael, forgiving yourself, forgiving your parents, and they're all at sort of various stages of that, that path. But she also talks about she has other people. A lot of people in the audience were themselves abuse survivors, and some of them are advocates. Like there's a doctor in the audience who had been on her show a bunch, and then Anthony Edwards is there because you recall he came out a few years ago about what had happened to him. He has an organization now called 1 in 6, which is the what's estimated the number of American men who are sexually abused as children, and he talks about sort of when they're doing the whole thing about how they had testified at the trial and how they had denied it for years. He says like my mother would always ask me and I would always say no, nothing happened, because I felt like if I talked about it and I admitted everything that had happened, it would just all fall apart. Like my entire life, basically, because everything in my life had been about what that moment meant and then getting past that moment, and to acknowledge that actual moment could just collapse the entire house of cards. So the movie is very methodical in terms of setting up the timelines and setting up the the process by which how do they meet Michael? How does Michael ingratiate themselves into the family? How does he then start pushing the parents further away and bringing the children closer,
while also insinuating himself with the parents? He was still faxing Wade Robson's mom. I mean, there's still, he wants the parents to be close, but then he's poisoning the kid's brain against his own mom and dad.
And constantly pressing them on secrecy and not telling anybody, and we'll both go to jail for the rest of our lives if this ever gets out. And then the process by which they get replaced by the new boy, and then sort of feel sort of left out about, kind of not sure what to do with themselves. And then, as soon as Michael needs them to come testify, suddenly, the charm offensive begins again, and they get sort of swept back up into it. It's, and from what I've read about it, the director was saying, the dates match up, everything that they talked about, we were in Paris, that happened, that it all tracks based on just sort of, objective research as far as where the Michael Jackson tour was then and all that kind of stuff. And so I believe them,
I believe them too. And what's fascinating is, and kind of sickening, is the pattern of it.
Yeah.
That both of these boys kind of looked alike as boys, and both were massive Michael Jackson fans and really gifted dancers. I mean, Wade Robson especially has gone on to this tremendous career as a choreographer during peak NSYNC and peak Britney Spears, and he does So You Think You Can Dance stuff. And so they're both really gifted, talented kids who Jackson brought them both on stage. Jackson brought them both on tour. As men now, they both kind of look alike. And both of them did find that when they did finally admit this, it did all fall apart for them. And that breakdown was necessary to work through and to heal. But I do believe them. It's a really grueling film to watch. It's really sickening and it's heartbreaking.
It's a tough 4 hours.
And it premiered at Sundance, and they had counselors in the lobby waiting in case you walked out of this film and felt like you needed to talk about it or you needed to share something.
Brought stuff up for you.
Right.
No, and I've heard people on Twitter saying, if you are a survivor yourself, give yourself a break. Maybe don't see this movie, or maybe take breaks and pause and stop and walk away from it and take a deep breath and come back to it. So I understand it is going to be a very hard watch for a lot of people.
For damn sure, don't try and do what I tried to do, which was watch it all in one sitting last night.
I did that actually.
How'd that go?
You're a better man than I.
Well, no, what happened was I started watching it Sunday night when part 1 had aired, and as soon as it was over, I was like, what happens next? Where is this all going? And they immediately put both parts on HBO Go, so I was able to just put part 2 on, and then a couple nights later I watched the Oprah follow-up interview with the 2 survivors and the director.
I should watch that. I watched it in pieces just out of necessity, schedule-wise. So I think I watched it an hour at a time at various points in time, and that was digestible, but still quite harrowing as the mom of a little boy who's about the age of these kids when they were involved with him in these horrifying ways. And it's hard to hold these 2 ideas in your head, but both of them still say, I loved him. I loved him. He was doing horrific stuff to them. And they both describe it in very matter of fact, almost clinical detail, but they both also acknowledge afterward, like, I still loved him and I wanted to protect him. And like Wade Robson even says, I didn't want to testify to the truth because I didn't want to envision Michael Jackson in prison.
Right. Well, I mean, James Safechuck talks about they had like they exchanged vows.
Right.
Like Michael put a ring on him, and like they that they vowed that they were going to be together forever. So yeah, it's hard to kind of remove yourself from that. And one of the things that Oprah says is when people talk about sexual abuse, they think that it's all like horrifically violent rape, and it's like no, the sad truth or just the truth that you have to acknowledge in talking about these subjects is that if you're a 7-year-old boy and somebody puts their hand on your penis, it feels good. It doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean that that's not abuse. But, when it's happening to you, you don't necessarily understand the violation that's taking place as a child. You aren't fathoming it until later.
Plus, he had this, he was Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
There's the cult of personality. He was the idol to both of these people.
Right. Exactly. But these are kids. They don't know any better, right?
No,
like,
not at all.
I mean,
but the moms theoretically should have. And that's a fascinating part of this, too, is that both moms are interviewed and they acknowledge, like, I asked my son, and, it didn't seem weird to me that their hotel room was down the hall or was a whole entire floor away, or they were sleeping in the same bed in Neverland and I was in a different wing of the house.
But it doesn't start out that way, right? Because it starts out where, like, I think it's Safechuck's mom is talking about, well, my son wanted to stay with Michael, and no, that was inappropriate. He had to stay with me. But eventually, right? So it's not, again, it doesn't just start out. It's not like the kids are strapped down and right.
But like he works his way into that family where they're driving to Brentwood to come get him and sneak him out in the car away from all the paparazzi to go hang out in their house at Simi Valley. It's like Michael Jackson could have gotten himself there if they wanted to, but bringing them into it makes them feel like, oh, you're rescuing me. You're
Encino, Havenhurst.
Sorry.
But like Jimmy Safechuck's mom was doing his laundry. He was another child to her, and then eventually the moms acknowledge. I got caught up in this life. We were flying first class. It was exciting. It was intoxicating to be in the middle of, peak Michael Jackson.
It's insidious, right? It doesn't start out that way. It's a step, it takes it probably took months to get to the point where the abuse is actually happening.
Yeah. He groomed them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's not an easy sit, but it's an important film, I think, and it raises interesting discussion, so I think people should see it.
Yeah, I think the second half drags a bit. That last hour, they really drag it out quite a bit. It feels a bit repetitive in terms of the territory that it covers, and some of the interviews kind of say the same thing over and over again. But you also need that perspective of how the abuse informed the men and the fathers that they would become. They both get married. They both have sons of their own, and you need that.
That aspect reminded me of Minding the Gap. In that it takes becoming fathers themselves for people to sort of realize what happened to them in their childhoods that could be considered abusive, and how do they end that cycle?
Anyway, it's really good, but it's really hard to watch. I'm saying 8.
I also said 8.
It's at 97% on the tomato meter. So yeah, that's on HBO on demand, or they're showing all the time.
Now,
so you can watch it if you so choose.
Thanks for watching. You can leave us a positive review or leave us a thumbs up here at YouTube and subscribe to our channel. You can also listen to this show as a podcast, and it's available at Spotify and Stitcher and all the places where podcasts live, and you can leave us positive feedback there as well. And do follow us online. We're at BeFastAllDay on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. And next week is a really busy week. Matt, you're not going to be here.
Correct.
Alonso, you will be here.
Yes.
Wonder Park opens, and lots of busy stuff.
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
We'll talk about it. So thanks for sticking around with us, and keep an eye out for the Shag interview over the weekend. Bye.
Bye.